So the first panel we talked about micro-targeting and really focusing on who to reach. But the second panel is going to be about social media and rapid response and connectivity, even on a BlackBerry. I love my BlackBerry. God, I'm so behind. Facebook to get out to vote. Social media mobilization in the digital age. Same panelists, different topic. There will be time afterwards for questions. Many of the panelists will be around, so if we don't get to your question during the formal session, please stick around for more one-on-one conversations or 1-on-3. So Ryan, back to you.
Thanks a lot. And we're going to be very loose about the topics of these panels. I'm sure we'll stray back into some of the targeting stuff and actually just a few loose ends that I wanted to get to in the last panel that I want to start with here. And Harper, I want to start with you. We were having an interesting discussion beforehand about the culture of Democratic politics and Republican politics, and maybe that holding back some Republicans with tapping the best talents in Silicon Valley or the tech world. So one, I want you to talk about that. And then two, when you were hiring engineers, when you were out there trying to find people to work on your team, what were you looking for? You know, so people in this room who want to do this one day, what were the resume that stuck out? And thirdly, tell us a little bit about the culture clash of Silicon Alley meeting, button-down Washington campaign operatives.
I don't know if you guys noticed the visual difference.
Dan's chest is actually covered in tattoos, though.
Yeah. Many of us have tattoos all over our bodies. So the first one is I have, since the election got over, I've had the privilege of talking to some of the Romney folk and kind of what they were doing on the technology side. And there is a stark difference on how we address technology versus how they seem to address technology. And I think we had adoption from the very top all the way down. And from them, it seemed when I talked to the people that were working on the campaign, it seemed that they had to fight up. So they would have some technology approach that they wanted to do, and they'd have to fight up to get adoption at the top. And they had some very talented people there, and from just a technology standpoint, they used the exact same technology we did. They used Amazon Web Services to host their servers. We used a very similar product to run our website that they ran with their website.
And that means when you use Amazon Web Services, everything's being hosted off-site.
Yes, everything's hosted off-site. So we ran very similar technology stacks, but I think where the difference was in the people and in the investment in how we treated technology. And so the difference was they looked for someone like me to help run technology and build those platforms, whereas the Romney campaign did not have that type of person. And they'd only later, and Teddy can talk a little bit about this, but they only later invested as much in technology as we did in the beginning. And so I think I started in April 2011, and that's when I started hiring engineers who came from Silicon Valley, startups, Google, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. As far as I know, I don't think there's any engineers from those companies that are Republican.
Is that right? Is the political divide that stark there in those places?
I talked to hundreds of engineers in my path to hire, and I had one tell me he was a libertarian. Well, with that said, I don't know if you guys ever hang out with DBAs. They are all libertarians, even if they say they're not. So just be forewarned. But we had one that said, I cannot work here because my principles are different. I'm a libertarian. I did not come across any Republicans. So I don't know the answer to your question, but in my small polling, that was what I got.
What were you looking for when you're doing that headhunting?
So what I was looking for is because we needed to move fast and we couldn't invent. So this is something that was really important. We had to just make it happen. We couldn't just test things and make sure it sort of worked. So we couldn't train people. So we need people that have kind of done it before. So we looked for people who had 5 to 10 years experience in building big web apps. And so we really called from places like Google or Twitter or Facebook. And then we tried to move, all the people that came from those places also said we moved faster than they'd ever seen, which I thought was a cool attribute to the campaign. But I was looking for people who would be better than everyone else that we had, and that would constantly be pushing us to be better, and constantly pushing us to be faster. And that's basically what we got. So we got about 25 hardcore engineers who had built these huge products before. Many of them could be CTOs in their own right. Many of them had very good monetary success, and many of them quit their jobs, and a few of them hilariously got raises coming to the campaign, which I think that was a testament to their negotiation techniques in their previous jobs more so than anything else. But we just tried to get people who had done much of the technology that we were trying to do before.
And how did the cultures get along? How did the two worlds?
Someone didn't follow the instructions.
Yeah,
I think technology it was hard in the beginning. I mean, I came in there and I was like, I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a badass. And Teddy and Joe were like, hold up, let's talk about some reality here for a second. You guys may remember this. But one of the things that is really exciting about being in a campaign is you're all there for the same reason. So at the end of the day, a contentious meeting or you're trying to ship something that's not working or for whatever, you're all there to reelect the president. And no matter what's happening, no matter what bullshit you're frustrated about, no matter what is not working, you always walk out of that and you can high five because you know that you're there for the same reason. And so you're there because you're both trying to help reelect the president. You're there because you're both trying to win this thing. And so even when there was that cultural clash, how many of you have worked with technology people before? So how many of you have worked with them where there has not been a culture clash? Okay, you're lying, because it's always that way. Like Dan alluded a little bit to hiding in these dark closets, and with glowing monitors. And besides Dan's cave, we were the people that took out the lights in the ceiling because we wanted it darker. And so it's just like how we worked was very different. And so there was a lot of uphill fighting. But with that said, it was also a really interesting experience. I had an experience recently where some Silicon Valley VCs came to me and said, hey, we really want to organize around this issue. And I said, you need to talk to some field people, which 2011 me would probably have never said. And so we all learned a lot about how campaigns worked and how politics really works. And I think everyone grew in that, especially on my team. I can definitely attest to that, but everyone grew into that direction.
Does anyone else want to talk about the
Can I say one thing?
recruiting and Silicon Valley meeting?
Well, can I say one thing?
Yeah,
I think that these guys know better than me, but the one thing I thought was interesting, because I was at OFA in 09 and 10, I think as we tried to get technologists, one of the most important things about being in Chicago versus DC was getting the talent. Probably 10% of your team would have moved to DC to do the job.
I don't think anyone moved to DC.
Maybe not even 10%. And that's actually, that's kind of a big deal. And so part of being outside the bubble was a lot of what we wanted to do on the campaign, but part of it was it allowed us to bring on a technology and digital team of folks who didn't really want to live in DC.
Yeah. It's not that bad.
Yeah, no offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same cultural dynamics are at play a little bit when you not just talking about the technology folks. We had a bunch of technologists or front-end developers on our team, so we had those issues as well sometimes. But there's also a broader notion of the creative community and folks who come from a film background or a writing background or designers, things like that, who we recruited who, 95% of our team never worked on a campaign before and probably doesn't even really want to work on a campaign again, but to be willing to go to make the case, in a recruiting sense that, you should take a 75% pay cut to come do a job that you probably did in your job 5 years ago, and do it for 20 hours a day here is a big ask. But when the cause is there and people are have the affinity and have that, as I said before, that sort of twinkle in their eye about their ability to be a part of something, you can make that case and come in under budget for your staff.
One other issue we didn't get to in the last panel, but that a lot of people on Twitter mentioned to me, is privacy issues with targeting. So how did the campaign, everyone smiles here. So this is a very complicated issue. You guys, this is all new. The data you're collecting about a massive number of Americans is incredibly detailed. How did the campaign think about privacy? Was there a privacy policy? And what are the implications going forward? How should we look at this issue? Who wants to start with that?
I mean,
Dan, that smirks.
I mean, we had a privacy policy and we had terms of service and we followed them, and they're pretty straightforward, and I think they haven't changed since, so I think this has been something that has been pretty straightforward for a while. And we try to be good neighbors, I think, in a lot of regards. I mean, we did this with email by making sure you can unsubscribe. One of the biggest innovations I think these guys added to our unsubscribe is a lot of people just wanted less email, so they added a little drop down that said I want less email. And so this idea of how do we be just a good neighbor generally on the internet? And then one thing that Teddy talked about was when we would screw up, immediately that would be on Twitter. And so there wasn't really opportunities to screw around with privacy. And because people would be very vocal about it. And this is a big deal. And we watch people like Facebook, and there's this great article about Facebook and Target and their targeting and what they've done, where Target was able to predict before women knew that they were pregnant based on the lotion they were buying. Yeah. And Facebook was able to predict when relationships were going to break down. And so, this is stuff that's really spooky and that's creepy. And so, we're on a little easier side, which is, we're using relatively public data to build some really good information to help, people do their jobs better. And a lot of the data people gave us, and so that was well within the privacy policy.
And Dan said something earlier. You asked about consumer data. I mean, I think you would agree, tell me if you don't, that the most useful stuff we had was either publicly available or self-reported. And so, either, look, the voter file, you can go on Google and download that. So that's not something that's proprietary to us. We've supplemented that with, 8 years worth of conversations at the door. But again, these are conversations where someone's saying, I care about healthcare. We would be doing them a disservice not to follow up with them about healthcare. And we would be doing the candidate and all of our supporters a disservice not to try to draw inferences. Well, this guy cares about healthcare. That that helps you build out a pattern and then in turn a model about how you got a campaign moving forward. So I think the vast majority of the stuff that we did with data again was either stuff that anybody can have visibility into, or people telling us what they want, and us in all good faith trying to serve them with a better campaign experience.
And so there was a time period where all of the reporters apparently thought that we had Social Security numbers. And it was this funny time where it's just like there's this like almost a projection of this is my fear, you guys obviously have it. And I think it's just because data is hard to talk about. It's a complicated thing. People don't, it's hard to even say what data means. There was even a data team on the campaign that didn't do anything that we're talking about here. There's a lot of...
What did they do?
Manage their voter files.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. This is cleaned it up.
Because when I started, they were like, and here's the director of data, Ethan Roeder. And I was like, oh, you're into big data. And he's like, no, I got lists. And I'm just like, okay. And so this is talking about culture shift. Like I hire all these Silicon Valley guys, and they're like, oh, the director of data, he's a data scientist, and he's just like, data what? So it was a funny. There's a lot of that. But anyway, I think data is hard to talk about, and I think especially it's such a nuanced thing that it's very difficult to talk about it in a way that is going to appeal towards all of the readers. And so I think this is actually something that's been built up in the press, both about startups and about just regular technology, plus about campaigns.
Dan, did you want to add anything?
No, I just echo Teddy's comments. I mean, lots of things about campaigns have changed over the last few years, and lots of things haven't, right? And over the past few years, our ability to take information and make better inferences off that information has improved dramatically, right? And who we talk to and why we talk to them and what we say. But the underlying data, at least from a voter perspective, continues to be, a voter file, set of appended attributes, and self-reported data.
Wait, say that again. A voter file.
A voter file, other self-reported data, and then our ability.
Self-reported data is when someone calls me.
Someone calls me, or they click on something online, and nowadays we're just better at saying, all right, based on these different actions and this different polling, this is kind of how we change our communication, our outreach to those people.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there's been a big underlying change in the type of data or the type of privacy-regulated data that we're getting. It's more on the back end that we're smart about those communications, and I imagine when people see that stuff and they see us using that data to make personal inferences on people, is that it seems worse than it already is, but the underlying structure really hasn't changed.
That's a really important point. I think one of the big differences in technology, just technology platforms between 2008 and 2012 was when we started talking about big data in the technology field, we talked about it because it was big and it was hard to store. And so it was really an issue of how do we get this data from here to over there. And anymore, it's not hard to do that any longer. What Dan and his team did was basically just use technology to get answers, not about technology to get data. And in 2007, before, it was all about how do we get more data. and then how do we store it? And so it's no longer about those things. So it's more about just how do we be more, or how do we be more efficient about collecting all this data, merging it together, and it's all the data we always had.
Let's talk about how you guys built tools and the most important tools, and sort of a lot of people were asking me about this, how the entire process from A to Z, from the need for a tool to which teams sort of design and do the programming, and how it gets into the field, and how you iterate from one version to the other. You guys had this dizzying array of apps, right? The Dream Catcher, Dashboard, the Twitter and Facebook blasters, the People Matcher, Quick Donate, the Optimizer. It sounds like superheroes. Let's pick one like the Facebook blaster and just take us from beginning to end. How the Obama campaign.
What's so funny, Harper?
we were so bad at naming these things. It's so funny.
So how take us through that process?
Yeah, I mean, it really started with a guy right over there. Yeah, raise your hand.
Who's really?
I'm trying to make this awkward for you. We're at the OC, okay? And it really started with a meeting between us and Joe, where we basically said, like, hey, look, we have all of our targets here, right? You have a social graph over here, which is like, we know who people are. You guys have, from 2008, and lots of people have downloaded the app, and essentially we had access to all these friends. How do we kind of put those two things together? Primarily, I think our initial thinking process was for registration and early vote, but really thinking about early vote, how do we kind of like build inertia from day one?
Yeah.
And what came out of that was, an early prototype, very kind of scrappy prototype, to take all the friends that people had, match them up to the targets, again, thinking about targets down as opposed to market up, and saying, this is how we match up people's friends who are targets, who have a close interaction, and then starting to kind of build and implement a pilot that could be scaled up by tech and have a fancy front end and all that stuff.
So who actually builds the Facebook blaster?
Well, so Dan's team did the first round, and so they basically built the prototype and tested it and made sure it worked and kind of proved that it was something that we could invest in.
Yeah.
Then at that point, we all kind of sat around and said, okay, let's
for
actually.
people that don't know what this is, just explain exactly what it is.
Well, it's actually we used it in many different ways, but one of I think the most important ways was on Election Day, sending messages out to millions of people to say, get your friend Bob to vote. Right, that was I think the most.
And if you have his phone number, call him, because
Yes.
you might be the only call that he gets.
Or stay
Despite
in.
the fact that
Because you
Jeremy's
might-
universe calling, everybody got called 12 times if we had their phone number.
But where
So these
Bob
are
is
people
where
that-
Bob is someone we've got to reach. I mean, not just any old Bob. Bob is a person who specifically we think is a GOTV target, and someone who lives in a state we need, and someone who is not likely to be reached by phone or not able to be reached by phone.
And somebody who's likely to be friends with you based on your interactions on Facebook.
Correct. Yep.
And so Dan's team went ahead and they built kind of the prototype, and they made sure that it worked, and they tested it, and they said, okay, this now works. And so then we would say to a couple engineers, now you work with those guys and make sure that it works in a very large scale. And I don't know the actual number of messages we sent on E-Day or GOTV. Was it?
Over the 4 days from Saturday to Tuesday, it was 7 million messages to 5 million people. Well, that's how many end targets got
Yes,
contacted.
yes.
How many got blasted? I don't know.
Yeah. But we did it in such a way where, it was very fast, very well done, and we could change the message at a moment's notice. So we could say, okay, now there's something new. If you're in Virginia, you need to tell your friends to stay in line. And so that was something that just suddenly, because that became an issue, it was reported in, we just switched on that dime and were able to change that message. And then so that was built and tested, and then tested some more, and then we tested various parts of it again. And then GOTV happened, and it worked. And then there were some tweaks during it. And I remember after it was called, we still had to shut it down, and that took way longer than I was happy with it taking.
You mean after the election was over?
Well, just because it was just cruising, we were all the messages are just shooting out, and we're we've already won. We probably should stop sending messages out. And we're just shooting messages out. It was literally a blaster. This was the most crude product you could possibly build. It just shot messages out of the internet. It was pretty brutal, but it was incredibly effective.
And Brian, I think actually the one app that is kind of the most complex and required the most integration was Dashboard.
Yeah, that was my next question. Let's talk about Dashboard, how it came about, what it did, and take us through the feedback. My understanding is you got feedback from people
Of course.
in the field and
Yeah.
improved it as you went along.
Yeah, so I mean, this basically comes out of what I said at the beginning, which is in 2008, Joe had this incredible, opportunity at the primary to there weren't people in all these states. They built out MyBo, and it was very, engaging for people. And then we kind of came along
MyBo
with this.
was My Barack Obama.
My Barack
which
Obama,
is-
you go on, you join a group, Women for Obama, or, Illinoisans for Obama, or, whatever, and you get on the group, and you're able to communicate, which is great. Then, I come
And
in.
to get a sense of how old MyBo was, it was probably named after MySpace, right?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Well, it was meant to be like your personal view of the website.
Yeah,
and
over
so
to-
it was,
But it's also
it was
better
the
than
idea-
Brockster.
Yeah, right.
Although
But
people,
that's just a sense of how far we've come since
Yeah, I
08,
mean, this
right?
is this is 2000, late 2006, early 2007.
yeah, although people called it my BO, which is all very awkward. so hopefully people got what it was, So, but anyway, that was great because it allowed people to communicate. And when I was in the primaries, I started in South Carolina. I got up to Maryland. When I got to Maryland, there was a organization that had basically taken place through MyBo, and they had weekly meetings, and they were rolling, And then we tried to come in and kind of fit this program into what was already happening there, and it was a little bit awkward. And there would be groups all the way through the general election in North Carolina that sort of existed online, but wouldn't interact with our organizers on the ground because it wasn't developed together. So what we really wanted to do this cycle was to develop our field operation in conjunction with our online operation, so that a person who came in online could be, ultimately connected with their neighborhood team leader, and a person who was a neighborhood team leader or working in an office when they go home could be connected in the same way when they're online. And so that was the idea, and we therefore sat down and we all spent more hours than we'll ever want to admit between technology, digital, field, and even communications from other folks, figuring out, all right, first, what's the problem? And then what are we trying to solve? Now let's figure out how to solve it. And that gets back to Plouffe's point earlier, is there was no vendor that we could buy this from. If we bought it from a vendor, we would have been fitting our program into somebody's technology as opposed to fitting our technology into our program.
Here's a good example of that. The Romney campaign used Salesforce extensively. And Salesforce is made for sales forces. And so I think that's an example of trying to fit your process inside of a software that is very rigid. And we didn't want that. We didn't want our investment to reflect that either.
Do you want to add anything to that? We were starting to talk about that at the end of the last panel.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is that, and I think this is something that everybody, we can talk about minor, cultural clashes, but I think this is actually an area where we didn't have that. We were trying to do a handful of things as a campaign. We were trying to recruit volunteers, register voters, persuade people, turn them out to vote, and raise money to support all that stuff. And that was it. And so the goals that we had were around fundraising, around organizing, around messaging, around recruitment. We had no goals for how many people were going to download this or that app. We didn't create stuff because we thought it would be cool. And so I think what I think is kind of interesting about all this stuff is it's high tech, and it's obviously cutting edge in the way it was built, but it's all kind of old fashioned. Like what Dashboard allows you to do is knock on doors and make phone calls.
Yeah.
And even this Facebook tool, what it allows you to do is talk to your friends. We're just ordering your friends for you and saying, here's who we think might be the most effective person for you to talk to right now, but you're still just talking to a friend. And I think all of us, to some degree, had a pretty old-fashioned sense of technology and of how campaigns ought to run, and then we tried to make that happen in the most efficient and effective way possible through technology, but without changing the goals that we've been working on for 4 years, that we would have been working on for 40 years if we'd been working on campaigns back then.
Right, and just to add to that, I think that both on the data side and on the technology side and on the creative stuff that we're putting out in terms of content, none of this was to try to make ourselves, look smarter or more creative or more interesting or whatever. It seems at times like the Romney folks would get mixed up in feeling like they wanted to be perceived as out innovating, and like they're trying to win that process story. Yeah. And we didn't particularly care because in the end, all of this stuff, and in many ways, we're happy to dodge and not talk about a lot of this stuff while the campaign was going on, because everything we were doing, whether it was building better model or building better technology or finding more creative ways to engage people, was about serving those people better. And so if you're a volunteer that's willing to give us a couple hours, shame on us if we're not getting the most we could possibly get out of those 2 hours that we can possibly give you. Yeah. Same thing if you have the tiniest inkling to maybe give us money to support the operation, shame on us if we're not taking it from you. And so that's this notion of having all these people having all these people with that sort of twinkle in their eye, about whatever they want to participate in the campaign, whether it's talk about the campaign to their friends or participate in the organization, like we gotta serve those people, and that's what ran through all of this, and that's sort of the like, okay, here's what we're all doing at the end of the day.
Yeah. Larry, you want to add anything to that?
Well, this does get back to what David Plouffe was talking about in his remarks, right, where he said that there's this sort of misconception that if the other party just kind of pulls some of these technologies off the shelf, they'll be technological too. And what you're hearing people talking about is they didn't pull anything off the shelf. We had problems we had to solve, and they had a thought process that led to a technological solution. And that's what you got to internalize in an innovating organization. It's how to go through that process, not just sort of pull something off the shelf. And it kind of goes to what you asked earlier, Ryan, about this idea of, well, who owns the OFA stuff, and it's the same thing for Democrats as it is Republicans. It's just not the case that the next race is going to be won by pulling the OFA app off the shelf and taking it from there. You've got to replicate this process of saying, here's the terrain, here's the problems, here's the strategy. How can I go about it differently and smarter than it's ever been done before?
Yeah, I want to talk about that next, about what's going to come. But first, there's a question from Twitter from Matthew McGregor, whose Twitter bio says he was a member of the campaign. He said, would the panelists rather fight a horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
I really hope that Matthew is watching the live stream of this. Well, so there's a backstory to this question, which is that when the president did an Ask Me Anything chat on Reddit.com, he got asked this question, and unfortunately, the person helping shepherd him through that process didn't notice the question, so he was not forced to answer it. I personally think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the beak on a horse-sized duck would be an impossible to defeat thing, and you'd be and the duck-sized horses you could presumably kick, and so I think you'd be insane not to try to fight the duck-sized horses.
I'm going to go with.
Apparently, this is a.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Teddy.
You look like
100%.
someone who's thought about this.
Well, as someone who's spent some time on Reddit, I have,
tell everyone
I
what
have
this question.
ignored it.
This is apparently a common question on Reddit. Right?
How many of you guys are familiar with Reddit? How many of you are Redditors? Okay. I think you're lying again. But so Reddit obviously is an online community. It's one of the biggest online communities that has sustained for a very long time. They have a very interesting story, and they have probably a more interesting community. But they've been pretty good at powering a lot of big movements, as well as participating in our campaign.
So when the president sat down and did that Reddit interview, is that just basically for fun, or is there a real strategic objective at the end of that? Are you?
Definitely the latter. I mean, I think a couple things are going on. First of all, the president really cares about technology and understands technology. And one of the things that Larry said, probably 2 years ago that really stuck with me is when you were walking us through our, sort of overall message frame, you said, our whole campaign is built on this idea that, the economy ought to grow from the middle out and not the top down. And sort of everything we talk about has got to come from that frame, except for one thing, which is that the president cares about technology, and that sort of people care about that, and that's sort of the only aspect of our message that that it doesn't really fit neatly into the core economic frame. And so, on the one hand, you've got a need to continue to remind people that he's someone who gets where how people communicate and how the world works and how the internet works. Yeah. Also, Redditors are young, white, typically left-leaning but somewhat politically apathetic people, and there's a lot of them, and they tend to sort of populate other social networks. So something gets big on Reddit, and then 3 hours later it's big on Twitter. I mean, it's a real sort of driver of what goes on Facebook and Twitter. So that was that was a very deliberate decision.
Yeah.
It was also fun to blow the internet's mind.
To have him on that. Yeah. So one of the articles after the election about what you guys were doing with Field, it was noted that you used volunteers for persuasion, which has not been a common practice in campaigns, that you don't want your volunteers going to the person's door, engaging in persuasion. You basically just want them gathering information. Was that a significant change in this campaign? Did your volunteer army become a persuasion tool?
Absolutely.
And explain to people the significance of that.
Sure. And it gets to what Plouffe mentioned earlier, and a lot of how Joe talks about what we're trying to do. I mean, it was this actual belief in 2008. Part of it is that our leader is a community organizer, which is, been the brunt of some jokes, but he's sitting in the White House, so I think it's a pretty good profession. But we fundamentally believed, which is the most important piece here because everything else flows from that, your budget and everything else, that a person talking to another person could move them to support your candidate, because they trust you. And they're getting all of this other noise that's really important. It's not like, we weren't cutting our, media budget all the way down. We believe that was important too, but it was one aspect that person-to-person, face-to-face contact could be used to actually move a voter and change their opinion. And I believe that, when we listened to David Plouffe and Axelrod and the president talk about that in the primary of 2007, it made us believe as organizers on the ground that what we did mattered, because it did. And then we were able to show that it worked, that it moved people through the analysis that Dan was doing, so we could go back to our volunteers and say, look, I know you only talked to 40 people this week, and you feel like you only moved 3 of them, or whatever, but look at how much else we're doing across the state, and how that's sort of adding up. So we just fundamentally believe that, and we put a lot of our resources into that. Here's the difference in Ohio in 2004. If I lived in Ross County in Appalachia, and I opened my door as a voter, the person I was talking to most likely was hired by ACT, which wasn't a campaign, wasn't part of the Kerry campaign. They were a paid staffer. They had been trained really well. They knew all the talking points about John Kerry's economic plan, what we had of it. I was on the campaign, so I can sort of make fun of myself. And all these other things, right? They knew it. They knew it really well, and they were trained well. But they weren't from Appalachia. And in the worst case, they were from New York with a nose ring. But that was sort of a different point. In 2008, when I opened my door in Appalachia, the person that was standing on the other side was somebody that I probably knew, or at least had seen around. Maybe our kids were in school together. Maybe I went to church with them. I definitely saw them at the grocery store. I was much more likely to believe what they were telling me was true and came from a place that I could trust, even if I didn't totally agree with it that one time. And then we took that to another level in 2012, where that same person was going back every single time because they own those 6 precincts with their little team, and they were building a relationship with those voters. And we were doing what David Seamus calls is running ward-level races on a presidential level. And I think that was kind of the innovation on the field side. And it all came, though, from our candidate and our leadership believing that it mattered.
How important was it that you did all this with an incumbent president, that you didn't have a primary? Could you have done it if he'd had a primary?
Sure. We could have done it if we had a primary. Fortunately, we didn't, but it allowed us to have a lot more time. But if we had a primary, there would have been a little bit more sense of urgency in some of these states. It might have even helped us do more work at some point. So I don't think it was lack of having a primary. I think it was, look, for example, Mitt Romney could have done this in Iowa. He could have done this in New Hampshire. Instead, he opened one office in New Hampshire. He put very few field organizers on the ground, and he had an opportunity when all these Republicans and all these independents in New Hampshire were paying attention to build relationships with those voters, and instead he put all of his money on TV. And so that was a missed opportunity to then, he had to go back and start over in all these battleground states, as opposed to what we did in 08, which was to have built these relationships that continued on. When the general election got there in 2008, we were way stronger for the primary, not set back for it.
Anyone want to add anything to that? So a macro question about what all of this is doing to politics, right? Technology in almost every field. As a magazine writer, I'm acutely aware of how the internet has changed. Printing stuff on paper and mailing it to hundreds of thousands of people. There are different business models out there now. So what you guys have been a part of is obviously incredibly disruptive to politics. What practitioners of politics have the most to fear? What are the parts of the business that are going to be obsolete or are going to change the most in the next decade or so, based on the revolution we're talking about today? Who wants to start with that? Larry, you've been around. You've been around the business a long time, and when you look when you look at this, how do you view that question?
One of the things that came up in the question and answer period with David Plouffe, I think speaks to this, which is, there is this kind of Moneyball aspect to what's being discussed here, and for those who saw the movie or read the book, this was kind of the fight between the baseball scouts who wanted to base their draft picks on statistical evidence versus those who'd been around a long time and felt that you should do it based on kind of their intuition as experts. And so this guy looks like a ball player, or has the right hustle, or has the right color hair, those kinds of things. Yeah. And so it was basically, facts versus bullshit. And when you look at political,
That applies to the policy arguments too.
But anyone who's been covering campaigns knows that there's a lot of that in campaigns, right?
yeah, and when you look at the people who were so horribly offended by the fact that Nate Silver was applying factual information, it's kind of the bullshit core. It's the people who want to predict where races are going based on things that actually don't exist and aren't important. And I think there's a real chance here to kind of cull through some of that stuff. I mean, this idea that was the ongoing story that David Plouffe alluded to of Romney's momentum, which was verifiably false, but that consumed so much oxygen at the end of the campaign, where we actually could have been talking about how we were going to solve the fiscal cliff, or what we were going to do about troops in Afghanistan, or any number of things. But instead, there's an obsession with Romney's momentum. Hopefully, we can kind of reduce some of the bullshit speculation and kind of resolve that with some really easily digestible and verifiable bits of information, and kind of open up the dialogue to some things that people would like to hear more about.
Anyone else want to tackle that?
I think the flip side of that is organizationally, there will be, campaigns on both sides in 2016 that will start from scratch, right? I mean, literally that's what will happen. All of them will start from scratch. They will open an office. It will be a big empty room. They will get some desks. They will start writing budgets. They will start hiring people. Yeah. And there's a whole set of decisions that have to be made about not just the practicalities of that, but about what kind of campaign you're going to be. And because that started with our candidate in a very real way, there's going to be a lot of variation, probably even just on our side, but also, of course, with the Republican candidates and how they choose to approach these challenges. And so, with that in mind, I mean, and the same thing will happen with all these governor's races, Senate races, as Plouffe said, and some are going to be pushing the envelope and running more digital, more technology-powered, more grassroots-driven campaigns. Others are going to run the same race that somebody ran in 2002. And you're going to see that play out in a bunch of different states over the next 2 years. But, for those of us who've sort of gone through these couple of cycles looking at these presidential campaigns sort of start up and go out of business, the big thing that stands out for me is the stuff that Dan was talking about with the party in terms of having the voter file technology and data, and have that be something that is at least a piece of what the campaigns on our side will be able to plug into in whatever shape they wind up being. When January 2016 rolls around, they will have that basic infrastructure. We were able to have our field organizers go through all these different states in 2008, basically using the same set of tools, at least, in a way that in 2004, like all different technologies, all different data, it was you had to retrain everybody to go from one state to another. And so the more that gets seamless and a little bit more plug and play in the sort of party institutional sense, I think that's to the extent that we can have an advantage, that's an advantage, but it's slow and it's sort of on the back end. And the big decisions about how these candidates and campaign managers are going to choose to set up their organizations and carry themselves is it's anybody's guess.
Just two observations, I guess, is as far as our legacy goes, there's kind of like a fixed legacy of products, but my kind of favorite story from the campaign was the organizing conference after the election, where this woman, Crystal or something, came up to me and she said, "Hey Dan, I just want to know, I really liked the list. I thought they were great, but the scripts that you gave us were ugly. I thought they were kind of poorly layered. I thought you should have partitioned them into 2 columns so you could structure our talking points better." And I was like, "I'm sorry, wait, who are you?" She goes, "Oh, I was a neighborhood team member in Cincinnati, Ohio." So, wow, where she had basically internalized the process of voter contact effectiveness at kind of, not the lowest level, but ultimately the lowest level of the organization. And that was kind of across the entire country. And to the extent that that distribution of that culture of accountability, of ROI, of expectations of high performance introduces a sense of competitiveness, at least in our party, into all future cycles, we will be advantaged because it will force people, either win or die, to adapt to these changing circumstances, and hopefully we do.
I want to get to some questions, but I just want to ask one final question, which is, is there any part of this that can be adapted towards governing? the president has now created this entity that theoretically will help him pass his agenda. What are the lessons for government? What are the tools that you guys created that can help someone you've actually helped get elected pursue their agenda now?
Well,
And then we'll do questions.
the point I made about David Plouffe at the outset, which was he was the manager, he was in charge, and if you went in with an idea and you said, this is new, nobody's ever tried it, there was a high likelihood that it was a good idea. It would go your way. If you said, well, we always do it this way, chances are you had to come up with better reasons for doing it. Think for a moment about the institution of government, right? There's just people are, for all kinds of different reasons, and part of it's self-preservation and part of it's habit and culture, but we have a way in government of basically doing things the old way, the same way. And I think it's to the extent that, and I think actually there's some initiatives the president's done and some people that he's involved in government who bring that mindset. But more than is there a statistical tool that was designed for voter contact that's helpful, to FEMA. What's more important is there somebody there who says, God, I'm sure there's a better way to do this than the last guy who was sitting in my chair. I want to be the one who innovates it. That's
it's more the culture than any specific.
No question.
Yeah.
And it's, by the way, that's a hard thing to, as everybody who's tried to change the federal government has found, it's a hard thing to change. But that's, I think, the key not only for government but for anybody who's out here thinking about the next campaign. Anybody who says we're going to do it like the Obama campaign is going to fall behind the guy who says I'm not going to do it like the Obama campaign. I think I can figure out a better way to do it.
Good answer. All right, we have a lot of people that want to ask questions, so let's do that.
First of all, I want to thank you all for the work you and the two Davids did to bring us this election. It's wonderful, and many of us really appreciate it. The last couple of questions sort of took part of my question, but my question is this: in 2014's gone, it's redistricting, and there's not much to do. But in 2016, are you guys a flash mob that's never going to appear again, or? And I think my real question is this candidate specific? Or could the DNC or some entity organize this for any candidate that is going to achieve the primary win in 2016? And as you suggested, take this down to the governorship level where we got hammered this year. And with redistricting, we're going to be hammered for another 10 years. So is it candidate specific? And will you guys organize again? Or how is a new flash mob going to come about? And by the way, looking at your personality types, I cannot imagine something more fun than to work with people.
I'm sure it's a barrel of laughs every
But
single
I will
day,
notice
right?
you're a little white and a little male. But other than that,
We are. Well, which is a problem, a big problem. I'll just answer really quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think it goes without saying that President Obama is an extraordinary candidate. So, there will be extraordinary candidates to follow, but no one exactly like him. I think, in terms, it's obviously not something that can just be applied to whoever wins the primary. I think, we were talking a bit about the culture of Silicon Valley earlier. From my perspective, all technology, and in particular social technology, isn't a blank slate. There are certain values that are sort of shared values, and they drive the internet today and the social web today. Things like a genuine belief in empowering people. And so that's what made the internet such a good fit for the candidate who was a community organizer. It wasn't a coincidence that the guy who spent his life before there was really an internet empowering people was able to take better advantage of technology that intrinsically connects and empowers people and gives them access to resources and tools and information and relationships. So I think, I think other candidates are, of course, going to be able to do an excellent job with technology and social, but I think going forward it's going to be increasingly important that they actually believe in this stuff and that it not be fake. I think had Romney had Dashboard, that would have been better than not having Dashboard, but it wouldn't have been all that great because it would have been on some level inauthentic because I don't believe that campaign really truly believed in empowering people and giving them tools. And candidates going forward that don't, no matter how smart their version of this flash mob, are going to be, aren't going to have much success with that.
I want to say on the long term, quick point on the can any candidate do it? No. We were able to run a grassroots volunteer operation and have the social and the technology, in part because it fit with our candidate's message. And it's not that it doesn't have to be Obama. I've seen candidates who aren't as impressive as Barack Obama run very good grassroots campaigns and win when they probably shouldn't have. So it's not totally candidate specific, but you can't just do this and then therefore win, because you have the right technology and the right digital and even the right volunteer operation. But more importantly, in terms of the long term, whether what we do in the future, the beauty of the campaign in the way we ran it is that we had from top to bottom a leadership program, a training program, where the woman who currently has my job right now at Organizing for Action is a woman named Sarah Elamine, who in 2007 started in Iowa as a fellow and now is the field director for the president's political arm. And I think every single person up here could share the same thing of the people that Dan coached and trained. This was the culture around building people up, training them, giving them, empowering them happened at the staff level as well. And so you're going to see these organizers running campaigns. You're going to see the digital folks that Teddy and Joe trained running digital programs for campaigns in 2014 for nonprofits, for profits, all across the board. And I think that is a huge legacy of the president's campaign, is those people who aren't sitting up here right now, but will be sitting up here in 4 years, sitting up here in 10 years, that were trained on this campaign either in 2008 or 2012.
Go ahead.
Thanks, guys. And this actually kind of gets to your point just now. But given that there was so much resource, availability within OFA, I'm guessing what's the map for innovating over the next 4 years? Are we sort of stuck with the same set of tools that you guys were able to develop, or is there now opportunity, given this sort of legacy and the infrastructure that the DNC has provided at down ballot races, to start innovating with these tools you guys have put together?
I can jump in. One thing that has, as a CTO, I was also did a lot of vendor management. So I worked with a lot of startups who were trying to build tools for us, and we used 0 of them. But they all tried. They came up to bat, and it didn't really work out. But what that means is that they followed what happened in 2008. They watched this culture of innovation, and they really jumped in. And so there's some amazing startups out there that are filling some of this void of tools. And whether or not Organizing for Action ends up using or open sourcing or whatever some of these tools that we built, I think there's a lot of opportunities to use, whether it's the tools that BSD is building or Nation Builder or National Field, and there's Amicus, there's hundreds more that aren't big names as well. And so that culture of innovation really shed off of OFA in 2008, and I think it's going to continue. There's a few people who are starting companies off of this version of OFA to do the same thing and to offer some of those tools. So I actually think the future is pretty bright for the next 4 years.
One thing just to add to that, it's particularly for the next 2 years in terms of the midterm elections, it's very, very difficult because there is no single office of a bunch of people starting an organization from scratch to innovate what's the best thing to do for this particular period of 18 months until an election. And so it's diffuse. It's a lot of different campaigns with a lot smaller sets of resources having to figure out how to do it from scratch themselves. And so the scale at which we were able to do it, because we had the runway of, an incumbent re-election campaign, is really, really unique. So what we were able to do in 18 months, primary campaigns are going to have to figure out how to do in 12 with much fewer resources, going into a primary in 2016. And so I think the barrier to innovation and keeping the ball moving here is high and difficult. But that should be a call to action for people to get involved, whether you're finishing up school or deciding what your next move is, for job. I personally, obviously, somebody mentioned redistricting and that the hopelessness of that kind of process before, but I really think that all the people who are sort of wondering what to do now with their volunteer time and their donations and whatnot, there are stakes, and to give a good run at the House, and taking that back to give President Obama 2 years of a working majority in Congress seems to me like a pretty friggin' important thing to put some time and resources into. And so whether you're doing that, working on different races, Senate races, governor races, House races, there are stakes, and there are campaigns starting up right now that people should, think about the stakes of and plug into.
Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say I think it's a lot easier to make duck-sized horses into burgers. And I would like to ask a follow-up on the privacy issue. I remember a while ago, Politico's Mike Alum interviewing Mr. Messina asked that the New York Times reported saying that if you sign on OFA website or something, you get a cookie that's going to track whether or not you visited a porn site or purchased a gun or something. Does this kind of online data tracking exist, or is it just an urban myth? Is it effective? And I know that similar tactics are deployed by commercial counterparts like Target or Facebook. But when it's used in political campaigns, does it contain potential backlash, evoking voter resentment, thinking this is further big government seeping into their private lives? Thank you.
Teddy or Joe, cookies. Did you guys, when I go to the web, Obama.com, BarackObama.com, what kind of cookies am I getting, and what is it? How does it track me?
Well, as Larry was talking about in terms of TV, there's no disambiguated personal information. So you can't come to our website and we know that you personally, visit whatever kinds of sites you visit. So of course we use cookies. Every organization, political, even nonprofits, everybody uses them. That's not going to change. I would be very surprised if there's a time in at least the foreseeable future in politics, the next 10 years, let's say, 20 years, when we want to know what kinds of sites Ryan Lizza personally by name goes to.
Wouldn't that be important information? I mean, Dan, wouldn't you want to know that? Would you want to know that information? Just forget about the privacy issues. But seriously, that would be very. That would help. You would obviously want that information, right?
Dan doesn't want to answer. But I'll say, think about what Dan said before about the relative importance of the third-party data versus the publicly available stuff or the self-identified stuff. In terms of the value to us of information that we can take in and then change our behavior of how we interact with you, the value to us of how you interact with us is exponentially more than how you're interacting with NewYorker.com.
So what I do on BarackObama.com rather than where I go afterwards.
And that's what we're trying to do when we're, with a cookie, we're trying to understand your user journey of how you're interacting with us, in large part. And if you go away, when you might get retargeted on some advertising, if you go to the New Yorker or New York Times, you might see an ad because we know that you were on our site. But
and that's based on the cookie that was put there.
But it's the interactions with us that are valuable, not what you're doing with your.
But to answer her question, there is a cookie that will. But seriously, this is an important question. There is a cookie that will have effects on my browsing experience across the internet after I've left BarackObama.com.
But it's not individualized.
If somebody is selling ad space, as all the media companies do, to people who have been on your site, if I want to remarket to you, yes, you absolutely do that.
So I might see an Obama ad when I go to CNN.com or something.
Yeah. The other thing, I just want to jump in here and say, one thing that's really important about this discussion is cookies aren't used just for that. That's not the only reason cookies exist. Cookies also exist so that you can log into the website, so that you can use the features that we've built. So I know that when you log in that's you, so I can make sure that we're giving you the information that you as a volunteer want. And so that's actually a really big reason that cookies exist. It just happens that there's some ways that we can also do retargeting on top of that. And so a lot of times the narrative here is that we only have cookies for these nefarious reasons of tracking your porn habits. That's absolutely not true. We have cookies for many reasons, but mostly it's just the mechanics of the web.
All right. On that note.
Yes. Mike Crawley, first of all, I want to thank every single one of you for coming here and sharing this. It's just a brilliant, brilliant group of people from the top down, and I think it's just wonderful that you come here and just share this exchange of information with us, so really appreciate it. My question really is, and I think, Larry, you touched on this, you talk about in response to the political scientists that say, well, why are we even doing any of this? There's two sides, everybody kind of knows what's going to happen. Is this even relevant? And then you focused on that middle tier that is critical, one of the core reasons for approaching this strategically. My question is, have you determined what the lifespan, the life of that data relevance is for that tier? In other words, is the intelligence that you've gotten in 2008, how relevant was that middle tier in 2012, and thus, how relevant is the 2012 data toward 2016, or are you starting over again at that point, or is it too early to tell?
I mean, Dan, you'd probably be better to answer that.
Yeah, it's all additive in the sense that it increases the amount of per person information that we have on people, right? And every time we have another cycle is we look at the electorate again and we look back at those IDs to say how do those impact their current, what do those reveal about their current day opinions about the candidate or about the race right now, right? So for example, in 2012, the most important group for us early in the race, so this is summer 2011, we're looking at people who supported the president in 2008 but no longer supported the president in 2011, right? Drop off, right? And there was some of that. And the exercise was essentially to go through and figure out who those people were, what were they thinking, what were their attitudes, why did they drop off, et cetera. And that record data that we had allowed us to provide what we think was an early diagnosis to help figure out kind of where those holes were. And later on, you know, depending on who's running, you know, even a Senate race in Florida, they'll be able to look at that data. But at each time, you collect additional information that improves your ability to provide subsegmentation to make better choices.
Can I just throw in one quick thing on that, which is it has value, as Dan said, but every single race is different. For instance, we had a closer race against Romney than we did against McCain. So it's easy to come to the conclusion that we got everybody who voted for McCain also voted for Romney because he got a larger vote share. Well, actually, it turns out that's not true. If you look at Ohio, for instance, there was a very important group to our win of working class voters to whom McCain felt relatable, and Romney did not. And this is a big part of winning. So each campaign has its kind of unique composition, support composition. And the individual stuff that we get year over year over year is cumulatively valuable, but it's always going to be applied to a unique fact set, two different candidates.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I remember I got to Ohio and they sent me this book about how to win Ohio, except it would have been perfect for a white guy running for president. It didn't really, it was totally different when I got there in 2008 because of who was running. It was just a totally different race.
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed with this panel, and I want to thank you for giving us so much information that we mostly guessed, at least I did. It seems like you answered my question because it had to do with election after 2008, and I think you already discussed it. My question was simply, what do you think happened? Why did we slide after victory in 2008? What happened 2 years later? And how do you take those lessons 2 years from now?
Good question. Who wants to start with that? What happened in between 2008
Well, I
and
can.
2010?
I went in January of 2009. I went to OFA, which was housed out of the DNC. And I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about here. I mean, I think Plouffe said it earlier. I don't think we'd have healthcare without the work that not just OFA did, but HCAN, labor movement, lots of other people who did do a lot of great work. And so the president, you know, accomplished a ton in those 2 years, and really probably more importantly than anything, saved us from what would have been an economic disaster. And in the process of doing that, you know, we had some tough, you know, the president didn't sort of go to Washington and, you know, say, I'm not going to use any of my political chips and I'm just going to let the next 2 years happen and, you know, hopefully I'll keep my popularity up and we'll win some elections. We actually went and did some things. And I think that was, I'll be more proud of healthcare and getting that passed and the 30 million people's lives that we affected than getting him elected, because that's what it was about. It wasn't about him getting elected. It was about changing people's lives. Why we lose in 2010? I mean, there's a lot of factors. We didn't have some great candidates. We had some atmospherics that made it hard for candidates to overcome. We didn't put enough money on the ground. We didn't put enough money on the air. We didn't have enough money. And, you know, the era of the super PACs was rough on folks in 2010. It's one thing to attack somebody who's been president for 3.5 years with money versus a congressman that you've never really heard of. You know, the shaping that they were able to do of the narrative with the kind of money onslaught, it was harmful for us in 2010. And this is a get to what Axelrod says often is we did have a lot of the data in 2010, right? We did have we knew we were going to lose by how much we lost by, right? Dan's model in 2010 was accurate, but we lost, which gets to the point, and we had some great organizing happening, and we lost, which gets to the point of, sometimes we can do a lot to make it a better loss, but there are sometimes that things are above our control, and it's not enough just to have the technology or just to have the data or just to have the field. There's a lot of other things that go into making these campaigns, and it's why this business is fun and interesting. And I think we learned a ton organizationally from the defeat, probably more so in 2010, than I would have imagined if we had won some of those races. We learned a lot about ourselves as organizers, and our organizers who worked in 2010 and 2008 were much better for it because they knew what it was like to lose as well.
Go ahead.
Again, compliments for all of the effort you put in, and a reflection on those who could not put in the kind of time you did and make the kind of contribution that you could make, taking off the time and growing. Nonetheless, you made a contribution to the democracy, a serious contribution, and you have to replicate yourself. And it occurs to me that two things that I saw, first as a fellow in 2008 in Virginia, that as the training went up to Fairfax, which is where I lived, it left behind a lot of folks who were clearly from the intelligence community, new analytics, and wanted to make a contribution and might have later on. And maybe you lost those folks, maybe you haven't. But just because they're not young doesn't mean they wouldn't want to, they wouldn't want to hang in there and join you again. So that was one interesting phenomenon where not everybody who can take off the time. A second phenomenon that I saw in this last election was that Scientific American, AAAS, American Academy of Sciences, all gave a quiz to Obama and Romney on their support for science and support for global warming. And Obama got like a C- and Romney a C+ because these groups were reaching out with this in this computational revolution, saying, well, let's try to apply that to the candidates and find some facts. But what they did was school teacher level grading of whoever in the campaign responded.
We're running out of time. Let's just get to the
And
question,
so
please.
what can you do to help these organizations in the future to connect to you, to make sure that you're supporting them?
Ways of expanding what you guys have done to other groups and having them borrow this kind of insights into campaigns.
Look, I think there are 2 points there. One is, to make sure that the campaigns in future, and I think we tried to do this, is to be interacting as a sort of, as Harper said, a good neighbor, on the internet and in general in terms of meeting with outside policy groups and think tanks and other advocacy groups to make sure their concerns are heard. And that's something, goes back to the successful campaign is something that is open and iterative and two-way, and that goes for dealing with organized folks in addition to individuals. In terms of taking the lessons out to the rest of the world, I mean that's I think what almost everyone here is doing with their time now, is to sort of take these the things that we've explored and the things that frankly we just started to explore and didn't get to finish. If the campaign had gone on for 6 more months, like there would have been incredible different things that would have happened by the end than what happened by the end as it was. And so taking those out, not just in the next campaign, but into NGOs and think tanks and nonprofits and companies and brands and museums and all these things, helps you look at the same essential challenge in a slightly different way. And I have no doubt that the team that we brought into 2012 was smarter because we had 08, but we were also smarter because we had a bunch of people who were outside in 2009 and 2010 looking at other types of challenges within, in the rest of the world, but with that sort of 08 mindset of how to tackle and mobilize people and engage them.
Both from the organizational standpoint, but also particularly from individuals. What might happen to individuals where they think they can tweet a couple times instead of canvassing? is that a worry that you think is
I mean,
realistic?
this is obviously not just with campaigns, but you hear this a lot with like slacktivism, and I think Coney 2012 really brought this to a head. But it seems to me that like the reason that we're all here I mean, we're all very different roles here, and we're all here talking about technology. I don't think Bird identifies as a technology leader, but I'm sure that in this regard, he is very much a technology leader. And I think that the point is kind of what I alluded to earlier, where I am now telling people who are coming to me and saying, how do I get more people to sign up for my email list? And I'm saying, you need to hire a field staff. And so I think there's just a blend. And I think, of course, if we just rely on Twitter, it's not going to work. And so, but at the same time, like as we've proven, like, you know, as was said in the keynote, if we just rely on the kind of the old-fashioned traditional style organizing, that also doesn't work. And so we need to do both, but you can't replace one with the other.
Well, just one more thing on that. The thing that we all have in common here is that we were all trying to get more people involved in the political process in this election, and our efforts to do that actually take place in a very narrow funnel of opportunities where we can move that needle. And so I think one concern, you know, that is valid is that our efforts to engage more people more intelligently, make participation more efficient and wider through the ways that we do can distract us and make us complacent and distract us from addressing the actual structural barriers to participation that do exist. And that's not just voter suppression stuff, that's the fact that we're not running presidential campaigns in every single state. You know, like things like the voting process, popular vote for president, you know, all these sort of structural issues that would blow the roof off of what we're doing at a very sort of small level and change the shape of the electorate and how we bring $1 billion campaign's resources to bear maybe across the country, you know, or if there are more opportunities to vote or it's easier and reducing the lines to less than an hour. These have huge, huge effects beyond the impact that our incremental decisions made in this particular campaign. And so as we focus on getting more people involved and we all feel good about that, there are also big structural things that can make an impact there.
I mean, one thing seems clear is to the extent that there was a point maybe in the 90s or early 2000s where the TV advertisement reigned supreme, right? And the way to reach someone was mass TV. What does seem the revolution we've witnessed in the last 12 years, whether it's for technology or not, is field has become incredibly important in democratic at least in democratic campaigns, and voter-to-voter contact is now a sort of, you know, every campaign talks about how important that is. I mean, would you guys agree with that, generally?
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you, and I want to certainly applaud the comments about field and technology working together. My question is, how much can this technology be scaled down? I'm the alderman of the 43rd Ward here in Chicago. I'm Michelle Smith, and I ran 2 campaigns, one in which we lost by 600 votes, one in which I won by 227 votes. So the field was really important to us, and there were just people we could never find and get a hold of because they live in high rises and we couldn't go to door, and they didn't have phones, so we couldn't reach them. And that's why I came here today, to ask to what extent can we spent a huge amount of money for an aldermanic campaign, but I don't think it was enough money to develop the kind of applications that came here. So how much can these technologies be scaled down for local elections?
You're my alderman. It's nice.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Nice to meet you.
How do you do? See? Are you on my email list?
I will be at the end of the day.
All right.
I'll start. I mean, look, I think this is a question of when, not if. I mean, you know, is this going to be sort of you know, is this going to redound downward by your next election? I don't know, and part of that depends on, you know, how much of it gets open sourced and in what kind of way, and what kind of startups emerge from the campaign, and how they sort of structure their product offerings and so forth. But this general type of politics and organizing, I don't think is going anywhere, and it's only going to become cheaper and more available, and you know, more available at the local level over time. And I think the basic sense, as Ryan was just saying, that organizing is important and people talking to people is important. That's also not going anywhere. So, I mean, I hope that's not too vague an answer, but I mean, I do think, I mean, maybe it takes 2 years, maybe it takes 10, but, you know, at some point, you know, people running for alderman, people running for state legislature, whatever, are going to be able to do these things.
I hope so. Thanks.
Okay.
So I'm the first year here at the university. I could just take it out. First of all, let me say, because I know my friend who tried to organize Cuyahoga County is here, and others who are Republicans, that it's our practice here, as you know, at the Institute to try and involve people from across the political spectrum in these discussions. And we did invite the Romney campaign to participate today, and that by their choice that didn't work out. And I don't mean that by way of criticism, because they've been extraordinarily generous for those of you who've been participating in these programs in terms of participating. But I think it's a measure of the disparity in this particular campaign that there wasn't a big appetite to be here for this discussion. And we invited all of these guys because they really did make some history here in the use of technology in campaigns. But I wanted to say that first. Second, I think what comes screaming through here, and what's important, and Joe and others have emphasized it here, is that the way we use technology was not to remote control our contact with voters. It was to actually make that experience more intimate. And in that sense, technology is an opportunity to re-democratize the system. And that's what David and others saw from the outset. And so it's important to note that. And in doing that, I remember our first meeting after the president decided that, yes, he was going to run. And he said to about 10 of us senior staff of the campaign that he had just 3 rules for the campaign. He said the first is that this is going to be a grassroots campaign, because this is the kind of politics that I believe in, and frankly, it's the only kind of campaign that folks like us can win. The second, he said, was we're a team. We're going to rise and fall together, and we have to support each other. And if I find someone not doing that, then they're not going to be here anymore. And the third, he said, was that this should be a joyful experience. We should have fun. So it's deadly serious business to try and change the direction of a country. But it's a great privilege and honor to be part of that, and we ought to enjoy it and enjoy each other. And I raise that because I hope you can sense from these guys tonight that, or today, probably is tonight, but maybe by the time I finish speaking, that we had an extraordinary experience together. And there was, all of those things were true. We ran a grassroots campaign, we supported each other, and we had a lot of fun working together. And you can see that spirit on this panel tonight. The last thing I want to say, or close to the last thing I want to say, is that I was struck also as I looked at this panel that there's probably billions of dollars of talent sitting right up there, and there are a lot of folks who would like to harness what these guys collectively bring, and we're so lucky to have you here today. And I want to tell all of you that one of the things that motivates me at this institute is that I know that there are people in this room who some years from now are going to be sitting on panels like this, having invented the next great thing to improve our system and promote campaigns. And that's why this is so important, because I think you're a great inspiration to a lot of the young people who are here today. So I want to thank you guys for being here and participating in this. And I really want to thank this unbelievable panel, my brothers in politics, but really such great, insightful, smart, well-motivated people. And I want to thank our moderator, Ryan Lizza, who's one of the great journalists in our country. Today, I'm sure many of you read his work in the New Yorker, and he's generally, like these guys, a little bit ahead of the curve. So we appreciate you being here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, guys.